Good afternoon and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Danella Hafeman will present Tracking Mood Instability in Bipolar Disorder, Advances in Neuroimaging and Digital Monitoring. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of 194 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that research funded by BBRF has had such great impact is because we do not limit our focus to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the foundation has awarded $475 million to fund more than 6,800 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain conditions, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Danella Hafeman. Dr. Hafeman is an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. She was the 2023 Claremont Prize winner for exceptional clinical research and a 2019 Young Investigator. Our webinar will begin with her presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to ask your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as time will allot. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Hafeman. Danella, the floor is yours.
All right, great. So everyone can see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right, so thank you first for this invitation. It is really an honor to be here, and I'm excited to talk to you all about work that we've done really over the last decade and even more now on bipolar disorder. I'm going to be focusing my talk today on tracking mood instability in bipolar disorder, focusing on both some neuroimaging study and findings that we've been doing, as well as some advances in digital monitoring. So I don't have any conflicts of interest. So my interest in bipolar disorder in young people really comes from a place as a child and adolescent psychiatrist. My research really is based on what I see in clinic, and bipolar disorder in young people can be very challenging for those individuals, and also in terms of treatment. So the disorder affects 1 to 3% of the population, and in particular, if bipolar disorder is not diagnosed or well treated, it can be associated with impairments in psychosocial functioning, high rates of substance use, and also suicidal thoughts and behaviors. These things can be especially disruptive during adolescence and young adulthood, right? So this is a time when people are trying to reach developmental milestones, seeking out independence, things like relationships, jobs, education. All of that can be severely impacted by a mood disorder, particularly if it is not well treated. But unfortunately, the peak onset for bipolar disorder is really during late adolescence and early adulthood. So in this figure here, the teal peak shows kind of the greatest rates of bipolar onset, and you can see that that's focused around this kind of age of 17 to 18. And then there's a peak just a bit older than that in the early 20s. So this really is the time when most people are having their first, depressive, hypomanic, manic episodes. Unfortunately, though, with diagnostic delays of at least 5 years, we're not sometimes seeing these people until later, like their later 30s, for example. And the delays in diagnosis are even longer in those with earlier onset. So if you have actual onset at like 13 or 14 years, your delay is going to be on average longer than someone who had their onset at age 22. So really the goal of my clinical work, but also research work, is to try to recognize bipolar disorder earlier to avoid these treatment delays during important developmental periods. And so that's really kind of a compass around which much of our work focuses, including what I will be talking about today. So in the talk today, I want to first get on the same page about what I mean about bipolar disorder, with definitions and kind of diagnostic criteria, how this relates to mood instability, and why this actually matters from a clinical perspective. And then we'll move on to more of the research in terms of neural markers of mood instability, focusing on network instability, and then finally using mobile sensing to detect mood shifts. So bipolar disorder is a disorder that is really characterized by these periods of elevated mood and energy, hypomania or mania. And during those elevated moods, people have a variety of symptoms, including either a very elated or irritable mood plus increased energy. So this is a very energetic state that often involves things like decreased need for sleep, sort of an inflated view of self-esteem, talking much more difficult to interrupt, thoughts moving much faster, basically a very energetic state. It can show up in a variety of ways, as you can see from this cluster of symptoms, that there are different ways that people can be manic, but that it really is characterized by this cluster of symptoms. Now, what you can also see on this graph is that there is some overlap between symptoms of mania or hypomania and other disorders, namely here ADHD, right? So individuals with ADHD, so attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also have, by definition, distractibility. They often have impulsivity. They're often more talkative and have a lot of energy, right? So how do we distinguish individuals with hypomania from ADHD? Well, it's really the timing of the symptoms. So you can see here with bipolar disorder, you have these hypomania or mania symptoms for a period of time, but then that resolves and goes down into a depression or a hypomania. So what we're really looking for with bipolar disorder is this kind of mood instability. So symptoms that are episodic, so they're different from most other times, right? During periods of mania or hypermania, people have more energy than they usually have. They're durable. So what do I mean by that? Well, symptoms aren't just lasting for half an hour or a few hours. They're really lasting for at least 1 to 2 days for this bipolar spectrum disorder diagnosis. They're concurrent, so they're occurring together in time. So it's not that someone doesn't need sleep 1 week and then they are more distractible the next week. We're really looking for periods of time where they're having these symptoms together. They're developmentally inappropriate. So especially during adolescence, right? A certain amount of impulsivity, risk-taking is normative, but the question is, how does the child compare to peers in the same situation? So many of my patients who actually, have hypomania, their friends will actually ask them, are you okay? Are you on drugs or something like that? So other people are noticing it, and it's not just kind of acting like a typical teenager. And then finally, is it spontaneous? So with bipolar disorder, these episodes can occur even in the absence of obvious stimuli. That's not to say they're not triggered by certain things. So some people, right, the seasons, the amount of light, a positive stimulus, all of these things can increase the propensity for a mood episode. but they're not always occurring, for example, on weekends, or not always occurring in response to an interpersonal conflict, right? So it's really this set of symptoms that relates to that sort of temporal dimension that defines bipolar disorder. And just to also make sure that everybody is on the same page, we really look at bipolar disorder as a spectrum. So, you know, for some people, when they think of bipolar disorder, they think of someone who is very manic. And indeed, that is one type of bipolar disorder where people have mania. These are periods of time lasting a week or more that are really causing market impairment. So things like, you know, losing your job or losing a relationship, losing touch with reality for that period of time, right, with psychotic symptoms. So people who have mania are characterized as bipolar 1. But that is not the only type of bipolar disorder. So further along, or I guess not as far along the spectrum, you have individuals who have hypomania. So these periods of time are lasting at least 4 days. They are accompanied by a change in functioning. So, you know, it's not like it's business as usual, but it can actually be an improvement in functioning. Some people with hypomania, they get a lot more done during those times. They're up all night doing work, that sort of thing. And we don't see market impairment. So people aren't losing touch with reality. They're not having psychotic symptoms. So individuals with bipolar 2 then have this hypomania, but then they also have periods of major depression. And then finally, we have other specified bipolar disorder, and we actually see this a fair amount in adolescents. These individuals don't quite meet criteria for bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, but they still have these clusters of hypomanic symptoms that are lasting for at least a day or two, and can potentially be causing some significant impairment. Now, many times people don't meet these criteria because the hypomania is not lasting for a full 4 days. But even so, other specified bipolar disorder, also called OSBD, and also bipolar 2, can be associated with significant impairment, but it's just often during the depressions. So it's not that the mania is causing that marked impairment. Now, we think of this as a spectrum, though, for a couple of reasons. In part, because about half of the youth with other specified bipolar disorder will convert to bipolar 1 or 2 within the next 5 years. So it is along a spectrum in terms of risk. And also, there is a fair amount of evidence that all subtypes can benefit from mood stabilizing medicine. So, you know, in particular, right, mania needs to be treated with an anti-manic medication. But even other specified bipolar disorder and bipolar 2 can really benefit from treatment with mood stabilizers. And so really a lot of our work in diagnoses, and for instance, in the clinic where I'm medical director, we really spend a substantial amount of time deciding, is somebody on this spectrum or not? And that's because there's real implications in terms of treatment decisions. And so I want to just outline that for you now. So this says in youth here. I would argue that also it's in adults, but it can be even more challenging in youth. So if somebody comes in with actual bipolar disorder, and maybe they're misdiagnosed, right? So this can be challenging, especially in the context of not having so much time to do an assessment. For people with a lot of symptoms of ADHD and unipolar depression. So let's say that instead of thinking that the person has bipolar disorder, the psychiatrist thinks, well, maybe this is unipolar depression, but they also have ADHD, right? So I showed you some of the symptoms are in common, so that could be a reasonable mistake to make. Well, then what you would do is you would add a stimulant to treat the ADHD. You would add an antidepressant to treat the depression, and there wouldn't be a mood stabilizer on board. Now, some people will tolerate this just fine, but for some people, it's not good. So that can lead to agitation, even psychosis or mania. So it's really important that, you know, we get this question right. But on the inverse side, if somebody actually has ADHD and depression, and someone does, you know, quick assessment and they find all those symptoms of ADHD and think, well, that must be hypomania, this person has bipolar disorder, then, rightly so, they would prescribe a mood stabilizer. But if it's not bipolar disorder, a couple things might happen. One, there are different side effects to mood stabilizing medicines, right? So I'm not going to go into them there, but for many people, they experience side effects. And then two, they're also not getting better, right? ADHD is not treated by mood stabilizing medicine. And so, so that's not good either. And so that's why we spend so much time with the diagnosis. And also, sometimes even after a 4-hour assessment, it's a longitudinal diagnosis. So finding out over time, are they having these episodic periods with concurrent symptoms? So I hope I've convinced you then that this mood instability, that episodicity of the high mood and then the low mood, is key to bipolar disorder. And because of that, my research focus has really been around this mood instability. And so 2 questions central to our research program that I will move on to now is, what are the neural markers underlying mood instability? And can we use mobile sensing to detect or even predict mood shifts? So we will start with looking at some neural markers. And focusing particularly on network instability. So the work I'm going to talk about now was funded in my 2019 NARSAD grant by the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation. And this was a study called the Bipolar Longitudinal Imaging Study, or BD-LONG. And the work was recently published in Translational Psychiatry, so you can take a look there if you are interested. So the question of this grant was really whether the mood instability that we know is so important to bipolar disorder would be mirrored by network instability. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by how we would measure network instability, but the 10,000-foot view is that the idea is that the healthy volunteers or controls would show a stable signature across time, whereas individuals with bipolar disorder would show more variability in this measure across time. And that variability would actually be related to mood symptoms in a way. So maybe, a certain signature during a propensity for mania, a certain signature during a propensity for depression. And the idea would that there would be these kind of oscillations in this network over time. And so the goal of this study was to test those 2 things. Test whether relevant functional networks are less stable in bipolar disorder, kind of how much variability there is over time. And then to test how these functional network connectivity changes with mood state. So do we see a certain pattern more characteristic of mania or manic symptoms, and a certain pattern more characteristic of depression? But before kind of jumping in, I want to take a step back and explain a little bit about what I mean by functional connectivity as we're kind of interpreting these findings. So I think it's important for people to know that when we talk about neuroimaging or functional magnetic resonance imaging, we're not actually measuring brain activation. What we're measuring is blood flow, or the bold signal. And so it turns out that when you're using a certain part of the brain, more blood flows there, more oxygen flows there. It all works quite well. And that also fluctuates even at rest. And so what we could do is look at how much oxygen is in the brain, in different parts of the brain over time, and get an idea of these fluctuations. And it also turns out that regions that are more connected in networks show more similar patterns of these fluctuations in the oxygen signal, right? So this is just a schematic here, but showing 3 different parts of the brain, A, B, and C. A has this kind of fluctuation of bold signal. B has a very similar fluctuation, and then C, it's a little bit different, right? So the idea would be that A and B would be considered to be very connected, whereas B and C would not be. And so that is essentially what we're measuring over time. Now, based on these patterns, what's pretty cool is you can break up the brain into what we call parcels. So this parcellation, it's by Shen and colleagues over at Yale, and they broke up the brain into 268 parcels, and each of these parcels has pretty similar patterns of functional connectivity with the rest of the brain. And so that could be a great way of, kind of simplifying a very large number of neurons and voxels. Furthermore, it turns out, like I said before, that brain regions that are active together and show similar fluctuations are actually involved in similar networks. So I've shown here the default mode networks. So these regions are more likely to kind of show similar fluctuations and have higher functional connectivity. Similarly, here you can see that these are color coordinated according to the network that they're part of. And so it's a way of understanding kind of how the brain is interacting at any moment in time. So that question of stability, right? Are individuals with bipolar disorder showing more instability over time? It requires that actually with healthy volunteers, we have a good amount of network stability over time. And so then there's the question, well, if you scan me today and scan me 6 months from now, will I show similar network functional connectivity? It turns out that given enough data, so at least 20 minutes, within-person stability of functional connectivity is fairly high. And I'm not going to go into all the details of this picture, but just to say that this figure B here, it shows the individual similarities, so how similar an individual is with his or herself, him or herself. And you can see that for most voxels, the similarity is very high across time, and that this increases as you collect more data. So it becomes similar to this concept of a fingerprint. If I fingerprint you now, and then 3 months from now, your fingerprints will look quite similar. That's the idea with the brain as well, that you'll be able to sort of tell whose brain is who based on that functional connectivity patterns. So that may be true with healthy volunteers, but the question is, do individuals with bipolar disorder show less of that within-person stability related to all of the mood symptoms that are happening, particularly in a mood-related network? So what do I mean by a mood-related network? Well, this was the starting point actually for the application for the funding from BBRF. We didn't think necessarily that the whole brain would show more instability in bipolar disorder, but rather the regions of the brain that are giving rise to these mood symptoms. And there was actually a fair amount of data in adults that showed that manic symptoms were associated with greater functional connectivity in a mood-related network. And that mood-related network included these regions shown here. So very much, this is a side view of the brain. And then this is kind of front to back. So very much toward the middle of the brain in regions like the ventral striatum, midbrain, amygdala, thalamus, and also frontal cortex. And so these regions are very involved in things like reward processing and also emotional processing. And so these were regions that were more connected during mania and actually less connected during depression, which led to the hypothesis for this grant that the regions within this network would be more connected in mania and less connected during depression. And so we tested this by recruiting a sample of individuals with bipolar disorder and healthy volunteers and scanning them multiple times over the course of the year. So you can see the age here. They were about 19 years old. Most of them were female. It was an even mix of bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. And most were on atypical antipsychotics. So these are medicines like Seroquel, Latuda, and then many were also on antidepressants, along with other medications. And then a lot had what we consider comorbid disorders, right? So GAD here is generalized anxiety disorder. About half of our participants had that. Many also had other anxiety disorders and ADHD. And so you can notice these were a fairly small sample, right? 11 individuals with bipolar disorder, 5 healthy volunteers, but they were scanned a lot. They were scanned longitudinally over a period of 9 months. The individuals with bipolar disorder were scanned in different moods 4 to 6 times over that period. And then the healthy volunteers were scanned 4 times. And because we needed that, a fair amount of resting state data to get that, that stable functional connectivity that I was showing you in the healthy volunteers, we had 20 minutes of MRI data, 10 minutes at rest, so staring at a fixation cross, and 10 minutes of inscapes, which is, it's a minimally engaging video, but it's actually quite pleasant. And so this was for each scan. So for everybody, or almost everybody, we had 80 minutes of resting state data. Okay, so then what we wanted to ask first is, how similar is the functional connectivity within versus between people? So do we see what we're expecting to see in terms of good stability over time, at least in the healthy volunteers? So again, this is whole brain, and each box here represents how similar one scan is to another scan. So each square is a similarity between the functional connectivity of 2 scans. Red is higher similarity and blue is lower similarity. So these ones toward the diagonal are quite high, whereas those outside are quite low. And what's interesting here is I've drawn little boxes around the individuals, and scans within those boxes, so scans within person, show much higher similarity than scans between people. And that is highly significant and supports this idea that the scanning over time is similar to a fingerprint, because if I scan you, if I scan this person once, right, I will know which scan this second person belongs to. So that's with the whole brain. Now what we wanted to do was take a look at that mood-related network that I showed you about before. And these results look a little bit different. I'll walk you through this figure. So what you see on the y-axis here is how much network mood instability there is, right? So the higher this is, the more unstable the network is over time. Each column at the bottom is a different subject, and the healthy controls are shown in blue, and the individuals with bipolar disorder are shown in red. And so again, each circle here is how different is each scan from that other person, that person's other scans. And so this circle here is asking, okay, this person had 4 scans. How different is this scan from others? And similarly for this one, how different is that from others? And then the lines represent average correlational distance for each person. So what you can see is that young people with bipolar disorder who are in red have a much higher level of network mood instability in general. This is a large effect size, 1.4, it's highly significant. And it actually almost perfectly distinguishes individuals with bipolar disorder versus healthy controls. Almost all of the healthy controls are down here, less than 0.23, whereas almost all the individuals with bipolar disorder are higher, with the exception of this healthy volunteer who did show higher rates of network instability. Okay. So then the next question that we wanted to ask is whether those changes in network functional connectivity were actually related to mood symptoms. So if you remember, we hypothesized that these regions within this mood-related network would be more connected with manic symptoms and less connected with depression. So did we in fact see that? So we asked the question, are mania symptoms at the time of scan associated with mood-related network functional connectivity? And we found that they were, but only during inscapes. So that was during the part of the scan that showed the nice videos and music. So for that part of the scan, higher manic symptoms, which is shown as a higher, it's called the Y-MARS over here, is associated with higher functional connectivity. which was similar to what we had hypothesized. In contrast, depressive symptoms at the time of scan were associated with lower functional connectivity, but this was dominated by individuals by the rest task, so the fixation cross task. And what was also interesting was that these findings were really driven by within person, not between person relationships. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's possible that, you know, the one subject, one participant is just in general more depressed than another participant, and they just have lower resting state functional connectivity. But that was not the case. What we found was that when one participant was more depressed, that's when they have the lower functional connectivity. So that this really was shifting within subject, which is exciting because what that means is that that is something that can potentially be targeted to be maybe higher in depression and lower in hypomania. Now, as I'm talking about this, I think, you know, it's important to think about, well, what are some other possible explanations for these findings? And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but I just wanted to kind of go through how we established, or at least, you know, tested that these were related to bipolar disorder and not something else entirely. So, for example, I told you that a lot of our people had anxiety, they had ADHD. So maybe these findings were just driven by these other disorders. So what we did was we removed participants with each comorbidity, each of these diagnoses, and in fact, the group findings remained. So it doesn't seem to be driven by these other disorders. It seems more specific to bipolar disorder. Similarly, these individuals were on medications, and some of them were switching medications. So what we wanted to do was see if things were still significant after removing the scan pairs with different medications, and also for adjusting for each medication class. And it really did not seem like the findings were driven by medicine. Observed sleepiness is another thing to really watch out for, because when we're thinking about stability over time, sleeping during the scan can lead to a lot of instability. And so indeed, we did find that having your eyes closed more was associated with less within-person stability, but that did not explain our results. And these group findings remained significant after this adjustment. And finally, this is a little bit more technical, but I told you before we use the Shen parcellation. People always want to make sure that it's not specific just to that way of looking at the brain. So we looked at another parcellation and found something very similar. So in summary, mood-related network instability, which I've been talking about, is a novel marker that really builds on the recent advances in precision imaging, in that idea that if you get enough data from a single person, that we actually see a good amount of stability over time, at least in healthy individuals. And then we can look at the instability in individuals with bipolar disorder. So the next steps to this, and they are pending funding, is that we want to test this marker of network instability in a larger sample, right? So this is still a small pilot study, and so we need to see if this holds with, you know, on the order of 100 individuals as opposed to the smaller number that we had. We also recruited people to have recent hypomanic symptoms. And that's because we wanted to be able to look at these different mood states. And so this was a way of finding people who were likely to have more symptoms. But it would be important to see if youth with bipolar disorder who didn't have these symptoms would also show similar patterns of network instability. And then finally, we compare bipolar disorder to healthy volunteers, but how about all these other disorders that might also show instability? So major depression is one. We could also think of, you know, ADHD or borderline personality disorder as others. And so what we really want to see, is this something that is specific to bipolar disorder that could be used actually maybe to help establish diagnosis in the future. Longer term questions that I'm very interested in. So I'm interested in, you know, markers of risk, and if we could use this to identify individuals with bipolar disorder, maybe even before they have their first manic or hypomanic episode, could be very helpful in terms of treating people more effectively and properly, and hopefully helping during those important developmental periods. And then finally, could mood-related functional connectivity, so the stuff that's increasing during mania, decreasing during depression, could that be a target of neuromodulation? For example, there's been really exciting developments in transcranial focused ultrasound that can perhaps influence activation or connectivity in these subcortical regions, that mood-related network of interest. So would it be possible to modify this through something like ultrasound or neurofeedback? So training people in the scanner to be able to modulate their level of functional connectivity. So these are all very much future directions, but they're some of the reasons why I'm pretty excited about this area of research. All right, so now we've talked about the brain. Let's switch gears to talk about mobile sensing. So, can we use mobile sensing to detect mood shifts? Well, first of all, what do I mean by mobile sensing? Well, mobile sensing can mean many different things, but in this case, what I'm talking about is using a device that is very familiar to probably at least most of you, perhaps all of you, a smartphone. And that's a device that we carry around with us, and that there are sensors, and this information is being collected, pretty much constantly by Google, Apple, these sorts of companies, right? But these sensors also reflect aspects that are greatly related to mood, and these include sleep, activity, and social interaction. So using an app, what we can do, obviously with the consent of participants, is to collect data from these different sensors that might reflect these very important characteristics and perhaps early symptoms of a mood episode. So these features include screen unlocks. How many times are you unlocking your phone? What is the timing of that? Are you doing that in the middle of the night? How long are you staying on your phone while it's unlocked? Then we have accelerometry and activity recognition, which get at how much are you moving around with your phone, right? So are you mobile? Are you more sedentary? As these things also can change a lot with mood episodes. GPS gets at kind of broader activity. Are you going to new places? Are you just staying at home? And then finally, keyboard logging and phone calls starts to get at more of a social interaction component. So then the question is whether all of these predictors or any of these predictors can begin to predict mood symptoms, so depression or hypomania, and mood recurrence, so maybe a major depressive episode or a hypomanic episode. And why do we care? Well, in the vein of early intervention, another thing with bipolar disorder is that often individuals become depressed or hypomanic and don't seek treatment right away. And so, as their psychiatrist, I might find out a month into the episode, which is not so great in terms of, early intervention and prevention of things getting worse. And so the idea here is that maybe this mobile sensing could be this early signal for mood changes that could eventually help improve our identification of mood episodes and ultimately the treatment of our young people with bipolar disorder. So the first question is, well, does this work? Can we identify mobile sensing metrics that imminently predict mood worsening? And so I'm going to show you some findings from an ongoing study. So there's still preliminary findings that indicate that we actually may be able to. And then, ultimately, the question about clinical impact is, could early warning signs eventually help to prevent mood recurrence? And that is a bigger question that I'll talk about a little bit later, but that we don't have data yet for. So related to these questions about mobile sensing, I'm next going to talk about this predicting mood recurrence in bipolar disorder, or prompt BD. And my colleague, Dr. Boris Birmacher, is the PI of this study. So the questions from this study that we'll talk about today is, does mobile sensing, the passively collected metrics from your smartphone, provide a good measure of sleep? And then, does mobile sensing predict next week mood symptoms? And so the sample so far, well, we have a target of 120 young people aged 14 to 26 with bipolar 1 or 2 disorder. They're recruited when they are in remission, because we're looking at predictors of recurrence. And we have 59 individuals enrolled so far. The protocol is to follow them for 24 months with mobile sensing. And then we have assessments and actigraphy every 6 months. And I realize I haven't really explained what actigraphy is. That's where people wear a watch called an actigraph or ActiWatch. That is I would say the gold standard of measuring sleep in an ambulatory setting. So being able to say what the sleep patterns are and generate several metrics of sleep. Currently in our protocol, we have about 6 months of follow-up and mobile sensing data. In terms of mood recurrences so far, we have 20 threshold mood recurrences, so 13 of depression, 7 of hypomania. We have 72 subthreshold or worse. So these are individuals who might have a depressive episode, but it only lasts for a week, or that's kind of subthreshold hypomania that I talked about in the first part of the talk. And we have more of those. We have 47 with depression and 25 with hypomania. And so we'll be focused on those for these results. Okay, so the first question is, can mobile sensing approximate actigraphy? So is it a decent measure of sleep? As a first pass, what we did was identify or really kind of calculate a metric that of sleep time, which was the total continuous offline time. And we defined this as the longest continuous period over kind of the nighttime with no screen unlocks or motion detected lasting for longer than a minute. And so the question is, does this map on to what actigraphy says is total sleep time? And now, you can imagine where this would go wrong. If somebody turned off their phone for hours before they went to bed, this would not work. Or if they woke up for 2 minutes or 3 minutes during the night, this would also potentially not work. So we asked, does TCOT approximate actigraphy-derived total sleep time? And we found that it actually does a pretty good job. So I'll walk you through this figure. On the bottom, we have this TCOT measure, a total continuous offline time. You can see most people have between kind of 4 hours and 10 hours. So, makes sense. And then on the left-hand side, you have the actigraphy derived sleep time with kind of also 4 to 10 hours of sleep. And so it turns out that this actually did pretty well. This is pretty highly correlated with an estimated correlation of 0.58, which is moderate. And TCOT pretty accurately assessed on average total sleep time. It only estimated it on average, underestimated by 8 minutes. So this is good news for the research, because we may be able to use mobile sensing as a metric of sleep. It's not great news for how young people are using their phones, because what this means is that people are really on their phones until they're going to sleep, and then they're on them kind of as soon as they wake up. So all the advice that I've been giving to my patients to turn off their phones an hour before and sleep in a different room is obviously not being followed. But for the purposes of the research, this is quite helpful. Then the next question is, can mobile sensing predict next week mood? And here we see that, in fact, it seems that it can. So depression is associated with less duration mobile, so meaning that they're moving around less. And it's associated with more screen time. So they're, when they unlock their screens, they're using the screen for longer. They also have more unlocks. And these things are pretty highly significant. In contrast, hypomania is associated with more physical activity, so higher duration mobile, and also lower duration stationary, so people are just moving around more. And it's associated with more variable sleep. So this is that TCOT, total continuous offline time, that I showed you before, the standard deviation of that. So individuals with manic symptoms, maybe sleeping eight hours one night, 4 hours the next, 5 hours the next, right? So it's more variability. And like I was talking about before, it's an important question whether these findings are significant only between people or also within person. So if somebody is more depressed, are they less mobile during the time that they're depressed? Or people who tend to be depressed also tend to be less mobile? And in fact, all of our findings were similar in the within-person models, indicating that these are actually things that are changing over time and could then potentially predict a mood episode in individuals with bipolar disorder. And just to jump back a bit to the last study that I showed you, the one funded by the NARSAD, we also had mobile sensing there and found pretty similar findings as what we found with prompt. We did find that less mean sleep time over the past week was associated with more manic symptoms. So here you can see that those who have, kind of more 4 hours have on average a higher manic symptom score. And like prompt, the more variability in that total sleep time, the more manic symptoms that that people are having. So it's nice to see kind of some similarity in findings across these two studies. So in summary, I think these initial findings offer promising evidence that mobile sensing metrics of sleep and mobility correspond to actigraphy-derived sleep measures, which is exciting because not everyone can wear an actigraph, and certainly not for a whole year, right? So that we have something in our pocket that can give that kind of information is very helpful, and that it can predict next week mood symptoms. The next steps are really to develop personalized models that could predict mood recurrence with acceptable accuracy. And the personalized model piece is really important because different individuals may have different sensors that are more predictive, right? So for one person, it might be GPS. For another person, it might be this measure of sleep. And so to be able to weight those according to the individual in really a more, personalized medicine sort of approach is our goal. We want to build infrastructure for just-in-time assessment. So just-in-time assessment means if the model says, oops, there's trouble, this might be a hypomania, then we're delivering a self-report mood assessment to check in on manic symptoms. And then eventually the hope is we can intervene. And there are many possibilities for this. On one level, it could just be evidence-based recommendations in an app. On another level, it could alert family members or a clinical team. And this is, it's analogous to diabetes where people wear glucose monitors. And if the glucose drops too far, people are alerted, family members are alerted so that they can help and intervene. And so the same model could be used here. Of course, it would be very much dependent on the participant, eventually patient's wishes, and the family. So in conclusion, I hope I've relayed to you today that bipolar disorder typically onsets in adolescence, and diagnostic delays interfere with reaching young adult milestones. So early identification of bipolar disorder is critical. This measure of network instability, especially in this mood-related network that is largely subcortical, so the more like emotion-related parts of the brain, may characterize bipolar disorder and map onto mood symptoms. And then finally, mobile sensing is a promising direction for imminent prediction of mood symptoms in bipolar disorder, with that goal of being able to identify when somebody is getting more depressed or more hypomanic earlier so that we can intervene. So with that, I would like to first acknowledge the participants and families, especially the studies that I just talked about, BD Long and Prompt. They are pretty intensive for participants, and without them, we would have none of this data, so I'm very grateful to them. Also, for all of my collaborators, special shout out to my mentor, Boris Brimmerher, and then the people in my lab, and of course, the funding organizations. So with that, I will finish up and take questions.
Well, let me say, Danella, that was an outstanding presentation and a lot of interesting and important work, and thank you for joining us to do that. I love the way you compare some of the monitoring to what people do with diabetes. And I'd like you to tell us a little bit more where, if we were to have this conversation in 5 years from now or 10 years from now, where do you think we would be in terms of the monitoring and the interventions?
Yeah, well, the goal is really to start to move from just kind of measuring these potential predictors to actually setting up the infrastructure to assess and intervene, and eventually, hopefully, having an app, that you could put on your phone that would do all of this, that would be able to measure the most predictive sensors, create these models, personalize the models over time using kind of more sophisticated machine learning models, and then have a way of kind of personalizing, okay, what would you like to, how would you like to proceed if the model is predicting or identifying early symptoms? So, this may include the app sends you a brief questionnaire about the symptoms. And I think this is where it would be, very personalized and could really take different, different shape according to what the values of the individual are, kind of how severe the episodes are. But I think, then you can really tailor both the modeling approach and the intervention approach to the individual. And that's going to involve collaborations with industry, with the people who are very good at building these apps, which we're starting to explore now. But the hope is that, this is becoming more of a tool that can be used in clinic as opposed to just in our research studies. I don't know if that will be 5 years, but that is, the beginning of the goal.
Great. I want to ask you, both from a clinical and a research perspective, one of the challenges for people with bipolar disorder and for their loved ones is that sometimes people really minimize their illness or minimize the need for treatment for the illness. What guidance do you give in terms of encouraging people to seek treatment for bipolar?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the most important thing is that people with bipolar disorder can find a treatment team that they really trust, right? And that relationship, that therapeutic alliance, that's what I see actually, in our clinic. We have the full 4-hour assessment, which is intense, and I recognize that not everyone can do that, but that really, it's twofold, right? It's building, it's a diagnostic assessment, it's giving us information, but it's also building that alliance where we kind of, really come into treatment knowing the individual. And I just think that's so important, because if people feel like they're not being heard, that, you know, it's really hard to continue with treatment. And unfortunately, I recognize that there are a lot of barriers to getting, you know, getting the treatment that people need. I think that insight is variable. Some people have great insight into what's going on, and can, you know, a lot of my patients will like pull out their mood trackers and show me like, okay, this is where my mood's been. But other people, you know, it jumps quickly to things like substance use. And so, I mean, it can be very challenging, but I think, you know, we use a lot of like motivational interviewing approaches. What is the life that person wants to live? Are they living the life they want to live right now? And then how could treatment potentially help? And also there's like, you know, no judgments, like the kind of idea that even I'm not going to make anyone start medicine, except for, you know, if like they're inpatient and under very severe circumstances. What I want to do is partner with people to be really, you know, pursuing the joint goal of helping them live their life worth living. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. I also hope that apps like this, that the neuroimaging underlying the disorder, that these sort of newer research perspectives and directions can impact stigma, because I think that's another reason that a lot of people don't seek treatment. And I think that the understanding that this is, you know, bipolar disorder is fundamentally a disorder of energy and the brain and the body, and, you know, and so reducing stigma around people blaming themselves, I think that also can help in terms of helping people also get the treatment that they need.
I think all of your points certainly answered the question. It's a difficult question, a challenging one. You really answered it. And I think what came across throughout your presentation and in the answer to that question is how important it is to engage the person, to meet them where they are, to take their thoughts and ideas into account. That's really the best way to help people. So thank you for sharing that perspective. Our time is just about up, so I want to again say thank you for the research that you have done, the research you're continuing and will do, the clinical care that you and your team provide. Thank you very much for all that you do.
All right, well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to be here and to talk with you today.
Great, thanks. I also want to thank our audience for joining us today and ask people to consider making a donation to BBRF today. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate grants. This means that when you donate a dollar for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientists. To make a gift, please visit our website, bbrfoundation.org, or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. And please join us again on October 14th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Stephen LaFontaine, postdoctoral fellow in the Experimental Therapeutics and Pathophysiology branch at the National Institute of Mental Health, will present Investigating the Biological Factors Underlying Suicide Risk. Thank you, and again, remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Take care.